Hi, welcome. Our first question is, what did you study at university?
Funnily enough, history.
History?
I did.
Okay.
Well, actually, my degree title is History with Historical Computation.
Interesting.
What that means is, over the 3 years that I was there, I did something every year that involved computing. So, in my first year, we all had to do a course that was on the census and on Doomsday Book, and so we had to create a database and work on some historical data like that. Second year, I think I did something else on Doomsday, and then in the third year, I did a course on the 100 Years' War, which involved looking at horse compensation rolls, which was on Doomsday. On computer as well. So yeah, and then my first year, what else did I do? I did a course on history of art, history of landscape and environment, the formation of Western Europe, decisive forces in the 20th century. So I did quite a varied thing in my first year. Second year, I tended to focus more on the medieval, believe it or not, given what I do today. That's a bit of a surprise, but did something on medieval English aristocracy, and gosh, what else? I did do one modern course on Europe since 1914, and then that's right, we had to do 2 compulsory ones. One was on government and society in early modern England, and the other one was on Victorian Britain, which I suppose is not a surprise given what I do now.
No.
And then my final year, dissertation on Doomsday Book, special subject on Doomsday England, a course on the 100 Years' War, and a course on the origins of England from 400 to 1066. So, lots of medieval.
Very interesting. Okay.
What attracted you to history, and in particular in the 19th century?
Well, what attracted me to history is the only thing I was any good at, to be honest. I remember when I was at school, I remember doing lots of things like the cavemen and stuff like that. They were our history classes, and they were really dull. But I think I didn't do GCSEs. I was the last year at school that did O-levels before GCSEs came in. And when we chose our O-levels, I just chose history as one of the 9 that I did, for no particular reason. And then when I started my O-level course, we had a new teacher, and he started to teach us about the First World War. That was the first bit of the syllabus, and it was the first time I'd done modern history. And when I grew up in a time where Germany was 2 countries, there was West Germany and East Germany, and the Soviet bloc was all, the Cold War was in its prime. So I'd always grown up with Yugoslavia existing, and Czechoslovakia and countries like that. And I'd never heard of Croatia or Serbia or the Balkan states, and so the idea of studying these new and interesting places when I did my O-level just fired my interest, and I loved it, and that's what started me on the road to history. In terms of Victorian history, why I'm doing that, it was more actually because of the IT side. That when I finished my degree, I was looking for something to do, looking for a job, and my personal tutor said to me, he came up to me about a month before I graduated and said, there's an advert here for a PhD studentship in Winchester, and they want to look at post-medieval Winchester. Why don't you apply for that? And I looked at it and I thought, that looks interesting, so I did. And in the interview they said to me, what would you like to do? Based on something on the computer and on Winchester after the medieval period. And I thought, well, there's only two historical things I really know a lot about. First of all is Doomsday, and that's not post-medieval. And the second one's the census, because I'd done this course in my undergraduate first year. So I said, I can do some analysis on the census, and that's really what got me started going on it. And that's where I picked it all up from coming here, really.
Okay, so what are you currently working on? Presently, what are you currently doing at the moment?
Working on trying to get all the admin sorted out in a minute, but that's not what you want to hear. Research-wise, well, I'm doing 2 or 3 things. There's a project I'm just beginning to start with somebody who was doing a PhD, but she wasn't able to complete it because of ill health, and that's looking at the Hungry 40s, the 1840s, and seeing how much the the country was actually in the depths of depression in the 1840s. What we're using in particular are the workhouse records for Winchester, and they survive in far greater numbers for Winchester than many other places. So we've got, for example, all the admission and discharge registers. So we know who went into the workhouse every week and who was discharged from the workhouse. And we've got their names, the parish they came from, what sort of condition they were in physically when they went in, and then the discharges, so we know how long they were in there. We know things like when pregnant women had children in the workhouse. So we can look at the number of people going into the workhouse and how that changes over time. But then we can also look at things like where they came from, because we know where they lived in Winchester and the surrounding parishes, and how many times they went in and out of the workhouse. So the idea is to see whether the Hungry Forties were as bad as they're sometimes portraying. So that's the project I'm just finishing.
Interesting.
Sorry, just starting. There's one I'm just finishing, which is which looks at the effects of the railways on Winchester. I mean, that was partly my thesis, but I've written something which is about the extent to which people often talk about the extent to which the railways impacted upon the city. Well, I'm looking at it from the other point of view, and trying to look at the way the city benefited from the railway. The other way on, how the railway company benefited from going through Winchester, because the line that goes through here, if you think about the 1830s, there are only really three places on the line. There's London, there's Southampton, the terminus as it was originally, and here.
Right.
Basingstoke's a very small place, and Woking and places like that didn't really exist to any great extent. So Winchester's the only city that the railway passed through between the two termini. So Winchester was quite important, and I've done a lot of work on the route through Winchester, which was originally changed. The railway was actually going to take a different route. It would have crossed the High Street much lower down and gone in front of the barracks and and effectively along what's now Southgate Street. That would have been the route of the railway line, and it was stopped. The Winchester residents and particularly shopkeepers complained. So clearly, the railway company felt that they were significantly important, and they changed the whole route. I mean, it cost the railway company a lot of money to have a complete survey redone of this part of the line, and thinking about, and they have to go through the whole process of compulsorily purchasing different properties and that sort of thing. So Winchester was very important to the railway. They took notice of them. They didn't just ignore Winchester. So that's the thing I'm effectively just finishing off at the moment.
What's been the biggest obstacle of your career so far?
Money. When I did my PhD, it was on a project that I was just a bit part player in it. Really, the project still running. It aims to look at the changes in Winchester from the medieval period on, or after the medieval period up to the present day. So we look at things like the property boundaries in Winchester. If you actually look at boundaries of properties, they don't change very much. All the way going back to the 12th, 13th century, you can trace the property boundaries. Sometimes you'll find two are merged into one bigger property, or sometimes one large property is subdivided. But actually the boundaries remain relatively stable. And because Winchester's a town where not very much happens, you find that actually quite frequently the buildings themselves survive. They might have a different front slapped on them, but behind it you've still got the timber framed building that might be medieval. Or in some cases, it's even earlier than that, we see one or two survivals. But so the idea was to look at as many sources as possible to try and retrace the development of Winchester properties over time. So things like the Corporation of Winchester, the council, owned lots of properties, and they take those. You can take the records of those properties and find out who was living in them at a particular time, what they did, how much they were worth, and see how things change over time. You can also look at maps. You can look at things like the census, street directories, and really you can get those sources start. Things like the leases, the corporation leases start in 1550. things like street directories go right the way through to the 1970s. So if you can piece all of those together, you've got a property history of the city centre over a very long period of time, 400 or 500 years. Problem is that leaves money, and that's been the biggest block, because trying to knit everything together, we've got lots of these sources computerised, but actually trying to work out where number 27 Middlebrook Street was in the 19th century compared to today when it's been renumbered is a difficult thing to do, and you need people to spend time doing that, to do the research, and that's what costs the money. So that's been the biggest block to my research.
Okay, so about sources, what do you find most challenging about them?
Challenging other people's sources, I find very challenging. I think one of the things about getting a PhD, I think, is that you know more and more and more about less and less and less, and you end up with a great deal of knowledge about the things you know about, but very little knowledge sometimes about other things. So, for example, when I was doing my PhD, there was a lad doing his at the same time. I was working on these 19th century censuses, and he was working on wills and probate inventories, which are only about 100 years earlier, from the 18th century. And I could read all the handwriting in my censuses like that, I still can. But you put a will in front of me, and it looks like a spider's crawled across the page with inky legs. I cannot read them at all. So I actually find reading sources that I'm not familiar with very challenging. But the odd thing is, he couldn't read my censuses either. So I think that's a challenge. Sometimes, though, it's the other way on, particularly when working in the 19th and the 20th century. My challenge is that there's just too many sources to be able to rationalise it and think, well, I would love to be able to... In fact, actually, that is probably my biggest problem, that there is so much information. You have a great idea to do something, but then you realise it will take 15 years to actually do because I work mainly with IT, to do the data entry, to put it all into the database before I can do any analysis on it. So there's a long lead-in time before I can do anything. That's probably the most challenging thing.
Are there any misconceptions about 19th century Britain or any other country for that matter? It's like when I think of 19th century, I think workhouses, child labour, Queen Victoria, Jack the Ripper. So what do you think are the biggest misconceptions?
Depends who you are. I think you just listed a whole series of things about the 19th century. Poverty, poor sanitation, the grim side. I think that's a big misconception, because there is another side to it as well. But equally, you can come at things from another point of view and say, oh, the Industrial Revolution was a wonderful thing because it made us the workhouse of the world. It made the poor, even the poor, richer than they would have been. It made people far more stable because they had stable jobs, they had permanent roofs over their heads, and everything was wonderful. So you can actually have exactly the opposite view, which is just as big a misconception as the grim, that the two coexisted. I mean, you find the same when you look at the 20th century as well. If you look at something like the 1930s, you've got the Great Depression and the Jarrow Crusade, and really difficult times. But on the same time, you've got motor car sales going through the roof, people buying their own houses, fridges starting to appear in the houses, and the very wealthiest able to fly abroad on holiday. And you've got these two things going on at the same time, and it's very difficult for us to get over the fact that we will have, just from our own prejudices and our own views, one view or the other of any period, and I think that's a difficult thing to try and get over sometimes.
So let's go back to the railways. Why are you so interested in Victorian railways, and what would you say is your favourite part?
I'm not interested in Victorian railways.
That was the impression we got. Sorry.
I'm being a bit flippant because I wrote a thesis looking at the effects of the railways. People don't listen to the words effects of, and they just hear the word railway. and so everybody thinks I'm a train spotter. And I spend a lot of my time trying to convince people that I'm not a train spotter. I don't know anything about wagons and rails and the F1379. I don't know anything about all of that. That's not me at all. Having said that, what I do have an interest in is the effects of something that, it's an invention that transformed the country in a very short period of time. Just from silly things like the time, well, not silly, a very important thing, like time being standardised across the country because of the need for rail transport to run to a timetable, to just people's worlds becoming so much smaller. Today, I think the best example I can give of it is today we talk of foreigners, we talk of aliens. An illegal alien is someone from abroad, and a foreigner is someone from France or from Spain or somewhere like that. Whereas I think in the 19th century, an illegal alien would have been someone from France or another country relatively close to us, and a foreigner would be someone from Dorset, so someone in Hampshire. People's worlds were that much smaller, and what the railways did was just expand people's horizons. It was a massive jump to go to London. It was a couple of days' travel to get to London. Well, now you can do it in an hour. And the travel time today isn't actually that different from the travel time in 1840. So, that is a remarkable difference, and that's why I'm interested in the railways, because they were able to transform people's lives in that way. And then on top of that, you just look at all the industrial side of it, the amount of heavy goods that they could transport, and the way they completely revolutionised the economy. Not necessarily in a good way in the long run. Coal, iron, steel, they made us very, very rich in some ways, but they also tied us to what became quite quickly very old-fashioned industries.
Interesting, thank you.
What are your thoughts on Les Mis?
Les Mis?
Yes. Set in France.
Yes.
But it's 19th century. Is that a good representation, do you think?
I enjoyed it. I saw the film. I've never seen the stage show, actually, I have to be honest. I've never
very
seen
good.
it on the stage. I don't really have many thoughts on it. It's a very good story, but I suppose it portrays... It's more of a human story, I think, than a story about things like industrial change, although that's in the background of it, isn't it? And maybe that's part of the point of things. We lose that maybe sometimes in history, that we talk about things like I've just been talking about, economic change and this, that, and the other, and you do lose sight of the effects that it has on human beings. And also, we talk about things like how long, in 50 years this happened, and that was a remarkably quick change. Actually, that's someone's life. And we talk about a quick change, but actually, when you're plugging away at a degree for 3 years, 50 years seems a very long time, and we sort of sometimes lose sight of that. So maybe the human side of things is an interesting thing to be reminded of, and something like this does that.
Some great songs too, as well. Okay. What advice would you offer for young upcoming historians right now?
That's a good one. The flippant one would be don't do it. You need a job, but that's probably about the worst thing I could say. I think there's a realism. You've got to have a realism. If you want to, quote, be a historian, you need to be aware that it's very difficult to get into. Yes, you can get a degree. It's easy to get not easy to get a degree, but it's easy to get onto a degree and study it because you love it, and that's fine. But then if you want to take it further, it's expensive, doing an MA, doing a PhD, and if you actually wanted a career in it, there are opportunities. For example, if you wanted to teach, great, fantastic. But if you want to work in a museum or in an archive, I think the current economic conditions, the first thing any local authority or any government does is they start cutting heritage budgets and things like that, because they're the easiest things to cut. So I think you find that if you wanted a job in that very particular area, it's going to be tough to get into. And then if you wanted to become a professional historian, you go and do a PhD and get a job in that sort of area after that, it is incredibly tough. I mean, my sort of job, we've got, what, I don't know, 70 odd universities in the country. They don't all have history departments, although most do. And you go and look in the Times Higher or somewhere like that for the number of jobs available each year. Not many. So it's very difficult to get into. So if you're thinking about it professionally, think very carefully about it. If you're thinking about it as a means to an end elsewhere, yeah, absolutely, you should do it. You should. It's a good solid degree that will give you a grounding which all sorts of businesses and companies that have nothing to do with, quotes, history will find very valuable. And historians are very employable because of that in areas outside history. And if you go into that sort of route, you don't have to stop the history. You can carry on, in your own way, doing your own thing. And that's the nice thing about it. If you're an engineer, you can't really do much engineering without the support and a backup of a company, but you can do history yourself.
Interesting, thank you.
Final question. If you had a time machine for one trip alone, for research or pleasure, when and where would you choose to go, and why?
But bear in mind, you can't interact with people. This is purely like watching, as if you're watching a film.
I'd like to go back and look at some. I like standing remains, I like buildings, and I would like to go back and be able to see something that we don't know. I doubt I could pick one, but just as an example, what did Winchester Cathedral look like before it was remodelled in the 14th century? Did it ever have a tower? That, when it collapsed, was there ever a tower there? Because it's never been entirely clear. I'd like to see old St Paul's before the fire of London. I'd like to see what the pyramids look like in their pomp. I think, not particularly astounding things. Just things that we don't know what they look like. I would like to know that sort of thing, and be able to come back and say, but I know.
That would be nice.
Yeah, but pie in the sky, that's not going to happen.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting.
It's all right.
Fine. Thank you for your time.
It's all right.